morning, everyone. Nice to see you here virtually. We really appreciate you coming this morning. I want to welcome our two presenters. We're very happy to have Dr. Janik Artiola, Mr. Gary Hicks with us today. It's awesome that they could make this happen on webinar. And very excited that you will be getting all this wonderful information about wells. I want to just couple a few housekeeping items before I introduce our first presenter. We have publications by both of these gentlemen available on our WaterWise site. So we will be putting a link up for that. And if you have any trouble at all finding those publications on wells or water quality and other issues, cleaning tanks and cisterns, let me know by my email. Thank you. I'm Marianne Capehart. I don't think I mentioned that. WaterWise program. And we also would like to invite you to chat. You'll see the chat button at the bottom of the screen. If you have questions, please type them in. I will be reviewing those questions. We may not get to all of them, in which case, please feel free to email me and I will send them forward to the presenters and we can get your questions answered that way. And I want to also just take this time to ask you if you could help us out with our funders, like to get information about what we're doing. So we have two surveys. One will pop up after this presentation. The Zoom session is closing, and that just gives us a little information. And then you will see a link for the other SurveyMonkey survey that you can fill out using that link, or you will get a link on an email if you register for this webinar this morning. So I just want to introduce Dr. Janik Artiola, born in Barcelona. Besides teaching at the University of Arizona Department of Soils, Water, Environmental Sciences, he speaks 4 languages. I like to put that in there. Yes, has been working in this field for quite a few years. We're very lucky to have him because this is actually his last year. He's retiring this summer, so we're very, very lucky to have him and very appreciative of all the wonderful work he's done in water quality and well care and all sorts of different topics. And our next speaker following is Gary Hicks, Mr. Gary Hicks, who is a geologist and a well driller and has been the president of the Arizona Wells Owner Association. If I'm getting that exactly right, let me know. So we're very, very, very pleased to have both of them, and I will give it away to Janik. Welcome.
Thank you, Marianne. Well, my name again is Janik Artiola. I'm a water quality specialist at the U of A Cooperative Extension. And Mr. Gary Hicks, my partner in crime, is, as Marianne said, a retired well driller and registered geologist. And he will be leading the first part of this presentation, this webinar. He will be talking about Arizona geology, well registration and regulations, and well components and maintenance. We will then have a short break. And then I will follow with a short introduction on water quality, what's in water, drinking water standards, and water treatment options. I should also add and emphasize that these workshops have been financially supported for the last 5 years by the Arizona Department of Health Services through a grant of the Center for Disease Control. And we're very appreciative of that support for the last 5 years. And with that, Gary, take it up.
All right, Janik, let's see if I can take over the control here and get my presentation going. Is this showing my desk? Just a moment.
It does.
That should be good.
Go ahead, put it perfect.
Are we good? All right. Well, thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Janik, for the introduction. Let me just say something though. about my position. I am still a registered geologist. I am a past licensed water well drilling contractor and a past president of the Arizona Water Well Association, which is the drillers and association. But it was introduced there on the slide as a Water Well Owners Association, which is something I dearly wish that we had, because unfortunately, the water well owners throughout the state don't actually have an association speaking specifically for them. So having said that, let me just pass on here to just a little bit of the review of what I was going to cover in my portion of the presentation. I'm a geologist, so I'd like to give you an overview of the Arizona water resources and the aquifers that we have, talk a little bit about geology, because geology is what affects the performance and the quality and quantity of water that you get from your well. There's just no two ways about it. You might hear me say it over and over again. Everything depends on location, location, location. Then also I'd like to speak a little bit about the private water well regulations and the agency that controls this, issues our permits for construction, license the well drillers and so on. And I'll speak and show some examples of typical domestic water wells that may help you to identify with the things that we're talking about. Those are the things above the red line. Then we'll take that short break Janique mentioned, and he will continue on talking about contaminants and water treatment options, and then we'll have some other follow-up and talk about some additional references and acknowledgments of everyone who's helped us with this and answer your questions. So, all right, so let me get going here this morning. The first thing I'd like to do is show you this image of the western half of the United States and what it looked like, what Arizona looked like back just a little while ago, maybe 10 down to 5 million years ago. It was quite different than it is today. The state of Arizona has undergone tremendous changes in the physical appearance, and at one time it was totally covered by inland seas. But at this point in time, 10 down to 5 million years ago, Arizona and the western United States was in the final stages of the shaping of what we have today. As you can see here, if this represents 10 to 5 million years ago, that there is a large area of California where the Central Valley was inundated by seas, and the Gulf of California hadn't opened yet at that time. But here's a picture illustration of what Arizona has today. From a geologist perspective, we say that there's 3 major provinces in the state of Arizona. The Colorado Plateau province, which includes Flagstaff and a lot of the towns and areas up there, the Grand Canyon, of course. And up there, the geology is quite different than it is in either of the other 2 zones. The transition zone through Prescott, and it runs from northwest to southeast through the state, is predominantly a section of more harder, crystalline, more resilient mountain ranges that have been there for millions of years. And then the third area down here on the bottom side, bottom 1/3 of the state, we call it the Basin and Range province. And in general sense, everyone's aquifers and the formations that we have to get our water from down there are pretty much the same. And they've evolved over the years. Now, this is a topo relief map of the state of Arizona, where we can see that in the upper 1/3 of the state, up here, there's lots of ridges and valleys and even some drainages, such as the little Colorado River and the major Colorado River running through it. And I can kind of see the hint of some resilient mountain ranges running up and down through the center portion of the state. And then the Basin and Range province down here in the southern portion, which is predominantly where we are today. Now, one other map that I like to use to get into talking about the aquifers and the water that we have is this one, which is from one of our publications. This map shows the state of Arizona, some of the major highways and drainages. And in this turquoise to teal blue color, it shows what have been designated as major aquifers. These are areas of the state that we know possess or retain a lot of water that is reachable by most wells. There's a large one up here in the northeastern portion of the state. We call it the Coconino Sandstone Aquifer. There's a little one or two over here in the Mojave County where I'm at today. And there's a few of them scattered throughout the transition zone, but you can see that the majority of the aquifers in the state of Arizona that have been identified are in the Basin and Range province down there. And there's a geologic reason for that, which I'll explain in a bit. But overlaid on the bluish color, teal colored, are some bright pink stippled areas called high salinity areas, areas where there are known salt deposits, mostly naturally occurring. But in these areas, in and over the aquifer that we have there, are some areas of very poor water quality. We know that there's a lot of salt concentrated up here in the northeast in that area, off around Williams and Sanders and off to the northeast. There's one in the Mojave Valley, Red Lake, we call it. And then when we talk about the others down here in the Basin and Range province, if this circle represents the area that we're talking about today, most of you would probably recognize what this stippled area of high salinity water, and that would be the Wilcox Playa right there in Cochise County. But that's what we have to work with on the broadest sense. If I come back to the Colorado Plateau that I described earlier, from our perspective, it's a lot of what we call layer cake geology, just one formation laid on top of another. Mostly the older ones are on the bottom, progressively younger as we get towards the top. And you can see that people in that zone only have a few choices for good aquifers. The Coconino Sandstone that I've already mentioned, the Mississippian Red Wall Limestone, which is a good producer of, for those people that it's not too deep for them to reach. And there's a few places where the basement crystalline rocks outcrop, and there are some people that get water from their wells from those formations, and a few from the basalt layers that are that cap some of the areas up there. If we look in the transition zone, and we gave a presentation not so long ago in the Prescott area, Yavapai County, the people there work with something just slightly different. It's similar to the Grand Canyon suite, but some of the formations do not cover the crystalline rock. So their aquifers are crystalline bedrock aquifers, or fractured consolidated aquifers, we call them, and a lot of very recent sediments, either in the sands and gravels or the basalts that have flowed out over the country up there. But down here in Cochise County and Pima County and around, and Santa Cruz, I guess, and even Yuma, the Basin and Range province looks a great deal like this. What it has left us with in the evolution of the geology here is a series of mountain blocks that are at or near the same elevation they've always been, but the basins in between these mountain ranges have dropped down due to subsidence. And we call them the grabens, or the down faulted blocks. And as these blocks have settled down in these basins, in some cases, hundreds, if not thousands of feet deep. And as they settled and as they kept going down, water kept coming in many cases evaporating. And that's where the salt deposits came from in our area. And it's still going on in the area like Wilcox Playa today. So there's a quick run through of the geology that you may have in your particular area where you live or your well is located. But let me show you what that means in the availability of the water for you. I'm going to talk about what we call porosity, and that is the ability of the different formations to have water in them or to hold water in them. On the three drawings at the top, let me look at this, focus your attention on the center one, which is what we call a well-sorted sand. It just means that just most of the sand grains in there are just about the same size and fairly, if it's good, if they're rounded too, or sub-rounded. but that can hold a great deal of water in the interstitial spaces in and around the grains of sand and or gravel. But the block over on the right-hand side, we call poorly sorted sands and gravels. If it's a formation like that that your well is in, imagine that the space between the bigger pieces of gravel and or sand are then filled in by smaller pieces of sand and gravel, and then the spaces between them filled in with maybe even silt-sized material. Then you can see that there's going to hold less water and the formation is going to be tighter and not give up the water to your well as easily. Now, if I look down at the bottom three figures, what we call the consolidated aquifer materials, these are the hard rock formations. They can be granites, they can be sandstones, limestones, rhyolites, all sorts of basalts, just sorts of things. But the water contained in these formations is only in the fractures, as shown in the center figure, or in the solution cavities that might be in limestone formations. And there are some limestone formations and fractured granite formations, both in Cochise County, in addition to the sands and gravels. For instance, cavernous limestone is what exists where Kartchner Caverns is located. But that's the porosity, and that's the ability of the material to hold water. If I want to try to explain permeability, that would be talking about the ability of the water to move through those formations with a little bit of a gradient behind it. And that gradient would be only 1 foot of difference in elevation. So with 1 foot ahead behind it, the ability of the groundwater to move, and it does, it's usually always moving. It moves at various velocities depending on the type of formation that it's in. If we concentrate on the unconsolidated formations on the left side of this graph, we can see that in coarse gravels, the velocity or the permeability of the water can be maybe hundreds, if not thousands of feet per day, but it gets progressively smaller or slower as we go down through smaller and smaller grain sizes. And you can see that where it went from maybe 3,000 feet per day for a coarse gravel, it could be 0.3 of a foot per day. Now, these are variables. They're not a fixed constant because of the wide sorting that goes on in the formation, and they're not pure sand. A sand can have silt mixed with it. A sand can have some clay mixed in with it too. That's just the way nature put it down. You know how we talk about the bottom too, silt and clay. You know how the geologist tells the difference between silt and clay? The geologist puts it in his mouth, and if it grinds on your teeth and feels like some of those coarse toothpaste, then it's a silt size. But if you put a little bit of it on your mouth, in your mouth and on your teeth, and it's just slippery, then it's a clay. That's a dirty job, but someone has to do it. Anyway, back over here to the consolidated formations. Let's talk about limestone, sandstones, and shales, and fractured consolidated rocks. All these have different permeabilities that allow and control the amount of water that you can get in your well. And again, it's just by choice or by chance is what formation your particular well was drilled in. Hope that helps you to understand why you might get the quantity of water that you do in your well. Here's an illustration that I used to be a little more detailed explanation of what is probably going on in most of your wells in Cochise County. We are in the Basin and Range province where we have 2 mountain ranges on either side and a lot of sands and gravels and coarse material that have filled in the valleys for many millions of years. And as the illustration shows, the coarsest material is deposited around the outside edges of the basin. And right there next to the mountain range is where some of the best recharge comes from as snow and rain melt and rain comes down off the mountains, flows into the ground. If I look over here on the far left side, you can see where someone might have attempted to drill a well here, but they were just a little bit too shallow, although with some very good material. And another well that was drilled a little bit too deep and got into bedrock and didn't get very much water. or another one just a little further out in the basin, drill down deep enough to get into a very good producing well, because they're into the coarse materials near the mountain front where there's recharge taking place. Let's shift our attention down here, down into the center of the valley, where it's right next to what might be a perennial or a through-flowing river, or a river mixed like San Pedro River. You could go out into the area very near the river in some places and drill down hundreds of feet and still be in the clays and silts and possibly even in some basins a salt deposit and not get any water. But if you went a little bit deeper, and we know that somewhere around Benson, St. David, and so on, there were wells that were drilled down deep enough that got into flowing artesian conditions and had wells that just ran on their own naturally for many years. But if the water table over here on the far end of the basin where the recharge takes place begins to drop, then even these flowing artesian wells will begin to slow down, if not dry up altogether. You can see that it's just a matter of how close we are to the mountain front or possibly to the river. If I use this illustration and say that this coarse material here right adjacent to the river is those shallow river wells right along the San Pedro, that's typical of what those wells would be getting, would be the recharge from the surface running water right there. So everyone's wells could be tapped into a slightly different aquifer zone of an aquifer. Here's another illustration to a little bit further. If you happen to be in some of the more fractured areas or further out, that would show me that you could drill a well into an area like this. The water table is the dark black line running along there. Get below the water table and hit a few fractures and get a modestly producing well. But if you were fortunate enough to drill into another location and hit more fractures that are in the consolidated rock, you can see that you could get a better producing well that way. That might be the explanation. And the same goes with down in the flats. It just all depends on, well, fate and chance as to where your well is located. And we have to look at each well individually to probably find a reasonable explanation for the productivity of the water that you get. Here's some additional illustrations that show how you could be in a fractured limestone formation and have a very good well because you're connected to a lot of the solution cavities, such as this one over here. And then you could drill another well in the same unit, the same limestone formation, but not hit any of the solution cavities and basically have a dry well. And that's just the nature of the geology and the way it works. Now, I could speak a little bit about water rights in Arizona, but in some ways that's a misnomer to think of water rights for the type of exempt wells that most private well owners have. But I can start by saying this, that the control and the management of all the groundwater in the state of Arizona, which belongs to the Arizona public at large in general, is mandated under the control of the Arizona Department of Water Resources since about 1980, when the Groundwater Management Act was passed, and they became the controlling agency. If your well was drilled before that time, it was probably under the control. There's their website, azwater.gov. They have an 800 number which you can call and get information about your well or about many things, about aquifers in your area, about water quality conditions known in your area. We can also note there that our well records, the records about your well, is public information available to anyone that can go onto the internet and look the information up. Now, this is something that was relatively new at the time that the Management Act was passed in 1980, but a lot of other states have followed up with this, and they also have their well data records public. California is just now, in the last couple of years, turned into making all new well records public, but all their old data is still privately considered to be private information. Okay, so as of 1980, all wells were required to be re-registered with the Department of Water Resources. And if we were in a certain areas of the state where groundwater decline was critical, you had to file for and claim a grandfathered water right. But that doesn't affect us in Cochise County, as I'll explain in a minute. And at that time, with the act, all new water well drillers had to be licensed by the Department of Water Resources, and then all new wells were permitted by them, and then all well abandonments had to be completed by a licensed well driller. So in theory, after 1985, at the very latest, we should have had a pretty good count and control of just how many wells of what type we had in the state of Arizona. I just wish that was as true as I've stated. And I'll explain why in just a minute. But now Arizona did create, in the Management Act of 1980, 5 active management areas. And here they're illustrated, and you may have heard about them or read some news about them. The Prescott AMA is one, the Phoenix AMA is another, Pinal, Tucson, and Santa Cruz. But we are in Cochise County, mostly, our listeners today, I guess. So none of the rules that apply to the wells in those areas apply in Cochise County. Talk a little bit about pumping water wells and how they actually work. Here we're going to use some kind of cartoonish illustrations to talk about a situation, and this represents as time has gone on. Here's a homestead out in the Cochise County. Built the home, built a barn next to one of the streams in original levels, drilled a well, and you can see that their pumping water well over here on the left-hand side, pumping water level has a little bit of a depression around it as the well is being pumped. But the water table, the static water level, as I'll refer to it later on, the original water table is the same as the flowing stream that was over here. This is be a perennial stream. Any stream considered to be perennial is in contact with the groundwater. Now, as time goes on, other people move into the area, and they also put in wells, possibly a deeper well. They might even pump it a little bit harder, draw the water table down a little bit more. And in some cases, it can have an impact on a neighboring water well, but it also has an impact on that perennial stream and the water table. They both get lowered. Now, we all know that scientists know that there is a connection between the groundwater as measured at this water table and the flowing stream. But in Arizona law, these are 2 different types of waters and controlled by 2 different types of management principles and so on. But this is what's happening, is that they are connected. And then we'll take a third scenario, and maybe it's representative of what we're seeing today, where something comes along and pumps the aquifer, the same aquifer that our homesteaders had their well in. Now, it can be a factory, it can be a farm, it could be a bigger development, a community development, or anything like that that creates. It can just be passing a time with a continued pumping of the same aquifer. And it has, in this case, it has pulled the water table down below the bottom of the homestead well. And this is something that has been occurring in Cochise County. It's documented and so on. Unfortunately, that is the situation. It leaves the homesteader with only option is to drill a deeper well or drill a newer well, maybe because the older well cannot be deepened. I can mention a little bit about that too, but everyone's aware now that these are the situations that can occur. So I've already mentioned the word the static water level. The static water level is sometimes called the pre-pumping water level, but it's the water level in your well when your pump is not operating. It's not perfectly static. It's being impacted by other people's pumping, and it's being impacted by the natural gradient of just moving from higher elevation to a lower elevation. So it's not truly static, but we use that term. Then the minute we turn the pump on, as shown in this illustration, you can see that the non-pumping water level, is pulled down to a pumping water level. But the pumping water level should be explained is that it's always at a point in time, because the minute you turn the pump on, the pumping water level begins to go down, it goes down, it goes down. It can go down to a point and sort of stabilize and very, very slowly go down further. But it can never go down any lower than the intake of the pump, because at that time it starts to pump water. But this is a phenomenon that happens, but it's not one of the most important parameters. The difference between the static and the pumping water level is what we call the drawdown. But what I would like to bring your attention to is not just the pumping or the static or the drawdown, but to think about this is, what is the recovery rate that nature puts the water back into the well when the pumping stops? Because that is a very important factor, and it can only be attained by constant measuring of what's going on in a well. And I've done that. This is an illustration of an aquifer test, I call it, that I did of a well some years ago. I started out, the pumping water, static water level was almost 200 feet. We'll call it 200 feet for round numbers. And then I pumped it. It was equipped with a pump of 15 gallons a minute. So I pumped it at about that range. In the first few minutes, the water level, the pumping water level in the well declined quite rapidly. And then it began to stabilize. And then it still was going down and down at a measurable rate. But after a certain amount of time, taking the water out of the well at 15 gallons a minute begin to closely match the ability of nature to put the water back into the well. So this is where the line, the graph of this line begins to flatten, and it never gets perfectly horizontal because you're removing water from this area and putting it somewhere else, so it's still always going down. But after a while, I could see from, I had enough data to determine that this is the sustained yield of the well. Well, in this case, it happened to be at about the same rate as the pump that we had in the well. We were not over pumping the well. So after 6 hours of pumping, I turned the pump off and watched the recovery water levels come back. And in time, they did. It took quite some time. But here's what I got out of that information. Pumping the well at 15 gallons a minute for 360 minutes, I got 5,400 gallons of water out of the well. And during the next 6 hours, I let it recover. I didn't get any additional water, so I still had only 5,000 gallons of water. But I saw that with being 1,440 minutes in a day, I could do 2 cycles of that type of pumping. So I estimated that the yield of this well was conservatively 10,000 gallons a day. Now that is a lot of water. And when you think about it, a 15 gallon a minute pump is a pretty good size. That's about the average. Most of the common size pump that we sell these days is a 15 gallon a minute, 1.5 horse or 2 horse pump. So that's typically what wells are capable of pumping. But is that enough water for your home? I certainly believe so. It's a half a swimming pool. And unless you're doing an awful lot of watering, that should serve you quite well. But as I mentioned, anytime that the well is pumping, there's a cone of depression that it creates around the well. And it's just the phenomena that takes place as you're removing the water a little bit faster than nature can put it back. But that cone of depression is an area that you should be thinking about, because you might want to think about what is happening in the cone of depression area around your well. What sort of activities are taking place in there? What sort of things are you doing in the area around your well? Here's a few do not evers, if you can follow them. On the upper left, there's a gasoline. You certainly don't want to be spilling any hydrocarbon products around your wellhead, as shown in the background. You'd like to not have animals depositing waste, either pets or farm animals. You shouldn't be composting or piling rubbish around your wellhead or covering it, as I have found in some cases. Also cesspools, septic tanks, that sort of thing, or the storing of large quantities of hydrocarbons anywhere within the area of your well. These are all no-nos of things to take place in that area immediately surrounding your well. Now, in the previous two illustrations, it kind of looked as if that cone of depression was a funnel-shaped thing, perfectly symmetric in all dimensions. But really it isn't, because if you think about it, as shown here with this large green arrow, shows the gradient of the groundwater moving through this part of this illustration. You could see that a well located here in the bottom of this brownish colored oval, you could imagine that a well pumping there would be pulling more of its water and from the up gradient side of it than it would be pulling water from the down gradient side of it. And the same way with the other wells, that you might want to think stronger about what's in the area up gradient of your well and a little bit less about what's down gradient of it, unless it's immediately adjacent to it. This source water intake that some people have, they call it, I'd say, actually a diversion of surface water, but you can see that if it was right near the edge of the stream, you would be mostly capturing water that's coming down from upstream. And it works the same way with your drinking water well in the groundwater area. I'll talk a little bit about your well, getting as close as I can to explaining what might be in your well. This photo isn't probably too different than what some of you might have, a well pumping into a water storage tank and then later coming out of that with a booster pump. But one of the things that Dr. Artiola and I have recommended all along, and we wrote a bulletin about it, it's called Arizona Bulletin 1663, and I believe you'll be given free access to a copy of that bulletin. It was about updating your ADWR well records. As I said early on, everybody's well records are public, but they're only public by voluntarily you putting them in there or getting a permit to drill the well. But from the time that the wells were first all registered in, say, 1980 to 1985, to date, it's been up for the responsibility of the new buyer of the property to inform the ADWR that there's a new owner on the well. Here's what happened. Initially, the Department of Water Resources and the real estate department didn't communicate well when this law was passed. And for a long time, a lot of the times where the deed was recorded in the county where the property transfer took place, that changed the ownership of the land in the county from one owner to the seller to the buyer, but no one filled out a Form 55-71A and sent it into the state, because the state is the one who keeps track of who owns the well, because they control the wells. And then there's another form in there called the Form 55-56, a pump installation completion report form, where it requires by law, by statute, to keep the Arizona Department of Water Resources informed about the current equipment in the well, meaning the GPM of the pump. And I'll show an example of that form in a minute. But all this information is required by law to keep the ADWR up to date. The other aspect of that is that when they wrote the law, they did not put in a penalty for not doing this. So no one's gone to jail for not reporting or keeping their well records up to date, but we highly recommend that you do just that, and for many reasons. You can log on to azwater.gov, do a little poking around on their website. You can select something called the Image Records Database and look through there and find your own particular well. You can look it up through a number of different ways. If you happen to have some correspondence from the Department of Water Resources that has any communications on it, they will refer to a 55 number for your well. Every well in the state of Arizona has a unique registration number. It begins with 55 dash and 6 digits. So if you know that about your well, it's that number for your well, it's quite easy to look that up and find what your records in the state records. And then you can print all these things out because they're all PDF files. So that's what we encourage you to do, is go online to the Arizona Department of Water Resources, poke around in there and look up your well records. And then once you find some of those records, print them out and keep them available for the next time that you need a service call. Now, here's what I'd like to show you. Some of you may have seen this in the past. This is a former map that the Department of Water Resources used to find where people could find their well records. And I love this illustration because it shows the distribution of all known wells in the state of Arizona. You can see the concentration of where they are. And this is an interactive map. So a person could put your cursor on any one of the dots there and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in until you find the dot that fits your well. Currently, the ADWR map of that same type looks like this, where the dots are so big and so jumbled up, you really have to zoom in the right area before you can find your well, but it still works the same way, that you can zoom in. And here's what I'll show you what happens as you zoom in. See, each time I click, I get in a little bit closer and a little bit closer, and you can do this and finally, if you zoom in enough, you can see streets and roads in that. And as I just did here this morning earlier, on the ADWR website, there is now a place where you can put in your street address or the street address of your well or where you live, and then it will take you to the well records. It's not as direct as filling in the 55 number with the 6 digits and going solely to your well. But if you fill in the address, it will take you to a nearby location, and you can poke around a little bit and find your well. So here's what I did for us today. I called up an aerial view of the area around Sierra Vista. Normally, when we're doing a workshop down there, we're out here at the university campus on the far east side of Sierra Vista. But this is the aerial photography, a recent one of that. And I took an overlay of the little red dots and put it on top of this area around where we normally were teaching workshops. And then I clicked on one of the little red dots. I don't remember now exactly which one it was, but that's how you can do it. You can see how easy you could locate your well if you got this far into the DWR website. Click on one of these dots and it'll take you to something maybe that looks like this. The dot that I happened to click on brought me to this well record, which was one of those original registrations forms, but it was filed late, I see, because it wasn't filed until May of 1989. It was filed by Frank and Nick Frankel and Nick Garcia on a little street in Sierra Vista. It was reported to be a 375-foot well, 375 foot deep. It did 35 gallons a minute, 6 inches in diameter, and it was filed in May of 1989. That was the only document in that particular file. And this is the phenomena that I was speaking about, is that so many times, if you go to look up the well that's currently serving your property, you may find that it is not registered in your name, which is something that we want you to bring it up to date, but it's registered in the name of the first person who registered it in 1980. So I was looking in the files, and I'm always looking for this form. This is the form I call the Pump Installation Completion Report form, 55-56. Let me go back. You can see that it contains a little bit of information on it. It has the registration number if it's filled in, and a few other little things. Now, this particular form was always gone out to the owner of a new well, and it said to the owner, when the well has been equipped, you will sign this form and send it in. That is by statute. You can see that down here at the bottom, they are supposed to sign it. Now, in the bottom left-hand corner of that form is this little square here. And this is the most important information probably about your well, other than the total depth is drilled and who drilled it and when. But the pump date that the pump was installed, the static water level, the pumping water level, what was the drawdown after 4 hours of pumping. You notice that this form suggests that there's a minimum of 4 hours of pumping, not 6 hours as I did in my test, but at least enough to know more or less what the sustained yield of the well is. And here it says, I am the owner of this well. You sign it. They did not put the responsibility for this onto the pump installers. It's on the well owner to take care of this. So owners have responsibilities to take care of your wells, and you must look at them and maintain them, inspect them once in a while. We wrote another bulletin about what to look at and listen for when you go out and inspect your well. And there is literature out there that you can find about what to look for and listen for when your well is operating. The other thing that bothered me the most as a contractor was access to the well. A lot of people, well owners, fail to keep quick access all the way to the wellhead. That must be maintained, because the minute the well goes down, you call the well and pump contractor to come out there and work on it. They need to be able to drive right to the well with a motor vehicle, possibly with a crane truck, to pull the pump out of the well. And if it's behind a barrier, a wall, or inside a building, or hidden in the rose garden or something, or trees have grown up in the way, you're just asking for more expense and more time before a contractor can get to your well. These are things that a lot of times homeowners don't think of. Lots of times I saw too that they weren't protected properly from the elements, and that can mean both the sun as well as the cold and so on. Also vandals and unauthorized persons. I could put roaming pests in there, such as, you know, javelina deer and other things that have got into wells and caused damages and so on. They should be properly protected. And one of the by far most important things that well owners' responsibility to do is to sample and test the water from the well periodically. I will say it once here, and Janique will say it many times over. No one is watching out for the quality of the water that comes out of your well except you. And if you're not sampling and testing it, you don't know what you're drinking. The other thing that I complain about a lot, or speak to a lot, is keeping your well records up to date. As a contractor, it's a lot better for me and for the homeowner if you call and say, hey, my pump has quit working, and I ask you the question, well, what size pump do you have in your well, and how deep is it set? Because maybe I wasn't the contractor that put the pump in the well 10 years ago, but now it's got to come out. You need a new one. It's a lot nicer if you can tell them, I have a 15-gallon a minute horse and a half pump set at 300 feet. Now that contractor knows exactly what to bring to your site, and you'll get your water flowing a lot quicker than if he has to guess or pull it out before he can even find out what is down there. And then keeping the change of ownership up to date is another important thing to do, so that if the state of Arizona needs to send you a form or send you information or advise you of something that's coming your way about all wells in your area or all wells in general, how are they going to contact you if they don't know who owns the well? And in terms of housekeeping around the well, I use this photo to show one day after working on this well shown here in the baby blue bladder tank, with my pump hoist in the background. And after we did the work, I stood back and looked around at what was going on in this area. And each one of these yellow 5-gallon buckets had a hazardous chemical warning label on it. I certainly hope that the homeowner wasn't dumping or spilling the ingredients of these hazardous chemicals out around this close to the well. A further thing is, look over here in the bottom left-hand corner is a gasoline-powered weed whip with the gas tank dripping gasoline onto the ground, and then a propane tank stored right beside the well also. So these are the things that I don't care to see, and you should not be having in the area around your well. It's your water quality to think about. Now, a little bit about some of the equipment in the well. I've generated some drawings that have been made available in a lot of our publications. This is a fairly typical standard above ground completion of a water well, or probably a newer one because I call it a two-piece well. Most of the wells today, many of the wells today, are constructed in this manner by installing a steel surface casing to a depth of about 20 feet, no less than 20 feet. That's a minimum in the state of Arizona. It's 50 feet in some counties in California. And then the driller will drill down, say, a 7 or 8 inch diameter borehole to the total depth, and then put in a 5 or 6 inch diameter, maybe PVC or possibly steel well casing. In this case, this drawing illustrates a smaller diameter casing inside the larger diameter, maybe 8 inch steel casing, and the well is completed after that, and shows some of the information. Now, there is another form of completion that's far more popular in most of the country. Built a few of them in Arizona, when we do a lot more of them in the northern part. But the concept here was that the water line leaving the well exits below the freeze line or the frost line. Now in Fairbanks, Alaska, that'd be about 9 feet down, but in Prescott, Arizona, that still might be only 24 to 30 inches in the ground. But this type of well completion has nothing else around it. It's very sanitary, very safe, and can be located anywhere that the contractor can quickly and easily get to it. And then you have the bladder tank and control equipment in another location that can be sheltered and kept out of the elements. But the well itself does not have to be located inside a building. Here's some examples of well completions and so on. In the upper left-hand corner, it looks like a 6 inch steel casing sticking out of the ground. This homeowner had a sediment filter in line directly at the wellhead, and Janique will speak a little bit about that later on. Sometimes it's necessary, but a properly constructed well shouldn't have too many particles coming out through it. Here's in the bottom left-hand side is another above ground completion of a well showing the captive air bladder tank and the controls all located in one small area. I have over here on the right-hand side a pitless adapter completion in one of the intermediate areas like around Prescott, where you can see that the well can be anywhere out in open area. A storage tank can be anywhere to hold water. They usually don't freeze, certainly all the way through. And then the pumping controls located inside a building. And that makes a pretty good arrangement when necessary. Now, wells themselves are made of different types of material, but they all have something we call the well screen area. And typically it looks something like this. It can be PVC, it can be mild steel, it can be stainless steel, it can be a number of things. But it has to hold back the formation down in the ground and allow the water to come in and keeping the sediments back. And he typically is installed by drilling a slightly larger diameter borehole in a fairly straight manner, and then lowering this casing and that down into it, and then completing the well possibly with some gravel packed material around the outside. This is just an illustration of how that's done. But that leaves you with an area where the perforations are the deepest part of the well, well below the surface of the water table. And if it's properly constructed, we like to have the pump installed with the submersible pump and motor in the blank casing above the perforations. This forces all the water that comes into the well to replace the water that you're pumping out to come into the well through the perforations and then flow upwards. And typically that, is at a pretty slow rate if it's flowing upwards. By flowing upwards, it not only cools the electric motor, but it typically is not flowing fast enough to carry sand. So the sand, any sand that would come in sediment would fall to the bottom of the well, the water would flow up and make your pump last a lot longer. But over time, these perforations, and here's a picture of one from a video down in a well on the right-hand side that shows that these slots can sometimes begin to close over with chemical precipitation and with microbiological precipitates around that too. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. But here, I want to show you one of the other minimum well construction standards that we have in the state of Arizona. Every new well since 1980 that was drilled was required to have a, well, theoretically, actually 1.5 inch thick was by the numbers, but 2 inches is the way we describe it. A 2-inch thick layer of cement grout around the outside of the uppermost steel casing to a depth of 20 feet. That's why the wells are made oftentimes with this 2-piece construction. The 8-inch casing set in a 12 or 14-inch borehole, cemented in place, and then the 7 7/8 borehole drilled down the bottom, and then in this case 6-inch steel placed, through that. Now every well has to be constructed that way. Now if your well was drilled before 1980, it can still be considered legal and safe and accessible until you perform a modification on it. Then it has to be brought up to standard. So the other thing about Arizona is quite unique is that we do not allow this upper 20 feet of casing sticking out of the ground to be PVC. You might in New Mexico and you can in California, but in Arizona you cannot have PVC well casing sticking up out of the ground. It must be steel. Here's a few illustrations of some other wells. 2 or 4 of them are pitless adapter wells. Some of the other wells here I'm showing in the bottom left-hand corner. A fairly common fault that I see with wells out there is when the well seal or the very top of the well casing is flush with the land surface or a cement slab. This is not desirable. One of the other minimum codes we have in Arizona is that the top of this well casing must extend at least 1 foot above the surrounding terrain. Some of these wells do not stand up 1 foot. That's to prevent it from being topped by flooding, or in this case, by rainwater falling on the cement slab, washing chemicals or bacteria down into the well. There should always be a foot or 2 of stick up of the well casing out of the ground. So if yours is too close to the ground, you might want to dig some of the dirt away from around it to make it safe. There's not too many objects around a private water well that the typical homeowner can service or maintenance or look at. The one that can be looked at with a little bit of care is this pressure switch I've shown here in the upper right-hand corner, the little gray box with an acorn nut on it. If you can take that acorn nut loose and lift that cover off, you'll see what looks like a series of switches and maybe some wires contacted in there. These are the point contacts that typically turn your well and pump on and off. So if you take this cover off and you have 4 wires there, that's 230 volts. You want to be careful. So you might want to shut the power off before doing it. But one of the homeowner service things that you could do is take this cover off, look down at those points, and make sure that the space between the points is not filled in with dead ant cells. Ants have a common habit of crawling into these little devices, and they happen to be inside there when the points try to come close, and their little hard shells are non-conductive, and they don't allow the electricity to flow from one side of the points to the other. So there you've just saved yourself a $100 service call if you can turn off the power and clean out the dead ants in the contacts. That just might be the one reason why your well is not working. If it's anything more than that, you probably want to call a licensed well and pump contractor. There's just some other examples of tanks that were common in older days. Hydropneumatic tanks, we call them. Air and water were in contact with each other. They did require a little bit of daily maintenance or weekly maintenance to see that they were staying at about half water, half air in them to make them balance. But fortunately, some years ago, bladder tanks came along, and they looked something like this. Most of these bladder tanks that have now replaced the hydropneumatic tanks have a bladder of some sort on the inside that expands as the water is pumped into it. Compressed air is held in the chamber above there, and air will compress, water won't. And as the water comes in, it compresses the air in this tank and then shuts the pressure switch off when it reaches the desired setting. And then the captive air in the top of the tank pushes the bladder downward and pushes the water back out into your sink or whatever you're doing. And the important thing here to recognize is that from time to time, this bladder in the tank can and does rupture. Usually it takes 5 to 7 years or something like that. They can go sooner, but that when the tank bladder ruptures, then the water goes through there, and then air begins to dissolve into the water, and then pretty soon this tank becomes waterlogged, and there isn't any expanding and contracting air. So the pump pressure switch comes on and goes off, comes on and goes off almost instantaneously. And that can damage the motor and destroy the motor and the pump in your well in very short order. So the one thing that a homeowner can do, a well owner can do, is go out and tap on the side of that tank from time to time, maybe once every couple weeks or so, and see that it sounds like it's hollow, because it should have a hollow sound in the top and more of a solid or thunking sound in the bottom 1/3 of it where the water is. If it's very heavy and you try and shake it and it's heavy, full of water, then you better call the pump contractor right away before you damage the pump in your well, because the tank is probably becoming waterlogged. So a lot of the things like the starter control boxes that we find on well completed in Cochise County and other areas like that look something like this. And there's not an awful lot that the typical homeowner can do to service these units. They're full of electronic components, and unless you're familiar with electricity and testing equipment, it's very difficult for most homeowners to diagnose what might be wrong with the well. But call a licensed contractor to come out and check your well out and tell you whether or not it's just in the control box or the pressure switch or something that might be down in the well. Here's the preferred way of mounting them. I have a disconnect in a starter control box on this panel away from the well, not mounted right on the well. And another device on there that I could recommend that many homeowners, well owners should have, is a pump tech device that saves the pump and motor in the well from operating in a run dry condition. That's a very good aftermarket product to put on there to save your pump. And shared wells, there's a lot to be said about them. I imagine maybe some of you that listening in today are on shared wells. They're a different kettle of worms, some have said, but they often look like this, where the well pumps into the storage tank and then a booster pump. And they should be fenced in and enclosed also, just to keep vandals and wildlife from getting in there and operating on them. From time to time, you're going to have to consider replacing that. It's going to be necessary to replace the pump in your well. They oftentimes, they should last 7, 10, 15 years. Kind of depends on the operation, kind of depends on power surges and how often they start and stop and everything. But I've pulled some that have lasted 20 years. But this is what they look like when they're going into the ground. Mostly stainless steel, bright and shiny, very clean. And it takes, some trained service people with the proper equipment to put them into the ground. When they come out, they look a little different. The photograph here on the right shows what a typical water well might look after several years of being in the ground, with microbial biomass starting to cling to it and form around it, a little bit of mineral staining. And then on the pipes, on the photograph on the left, I see that that's a PVC pipe. It does show some signs of discoloration, but it won't be corroding or being eaten away as a mild steel pipe or galvanized pipe might be. Here's a galvanized pipe in this photo on the left, showing the tubercles or blisters that form and how underneath those deposits, bacteria are working to literally eat holes in that pipe. And sometimes they'll eat a hole so drastic that you don't get any water out of your well. Your pump and motor is still perfectly good, but your drop pipe has a hole in it. they'll also attack the electrical wiring and make it difficult to get the pump to operate. The last couple of photos I'm used here to show the men on the left were former employees of mine pulling a pump from a well, perhaps putting the existing pump back in. I'm not sure in that photo, but take a look at how they're working and how I'm working over here in this and putting my own pump in my well some years back on this side. And this is fairly typical of what servicemen do these days and how it has to be done. This is not operating room clean procedures. And you can see that because we typically didn't have gloved hands on at the time. We weren't wearing masks on our face at that time, but times may change now. But this can be one of the sources of the introduction of bacteria into your well, just human caused. And they can be a problem, although the kind of bacteria that we talk about that's most serious and most harmful to humans when they start to drink the water come from a different source. But I'm going to let Janique come in here now and take over and talk about the perils of bacteria in your well and what some of the other things are that might be in your well and so on. Janique, how about that? I turn it over to you now.
I think we're okay. We'll see how time goes after I finish, but can we just go ahead and maybe take a few minutes break, maybe reconvene at 11:15, everybody? Everybody be okay with that? Stretch your legs.
Sounds good.
All righty. So we'll see you in about 7 minutes. All right.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Gary.
Do you want to unshare your screen, Gary? You did? Yeah, okay. Okay, hope you can all see my screen. So this is the outline of my presentation here. What determines water quality, very briefly, common contaminants in Arizona based on a 20-year-old survey, water quality standards, primary and secondary, water testing, and then some information about water treatment options. So let's look very briefly at what's in water. And if you take a drop of water and you remove most of the water, you're left at the bottom with some scale or some grayish stuff. And so you'll find that asking a chemist will tell you, well, that's mostly ultra trace and salts and stuff like that. And this is what about 80 to 90% or even 95% of what's in water. It's mostly dissolved chemicals that come from the dissolution of minerals that are found in your aquifer or surface waters or whatever. They're mostly benign chemicals with the possible exception of nitrates. So there's nothing wrong with that, but there's still something else left there. And so here you see trace and ultra trace metals and organics. And again, what's that? So here you're looking at the rest of the periodic table, I like to say, are iron, copper, zinc, lead, arsenic, you name it. It also has some of the new contaminants like solvents and pesticides. And this little thing here called organic matter, and I'll be talking more about that. I hope you all know what organic matter is. It's basically we're all made out of organic matter, just plants and animal residues, and even water that is thousands of years old contains some organic matter. And we'll talk more about that, why that's important when it comes to chlorination. And again, there's still something else left down there. And this is where we get into the realm of ultra-trace organics and inorganics. And this is really the forefront of water standards now. We're looking at, due to the advances in analytical chemistry, levels of, we're detecting in more and more in surface waters and waters that have been impacted by discharges of effluent. Personal care products, you all know what those are, shampoos, things like that. Pharmaceuticals, lots of pharmaceuticals are found in water, antibiotics, hormones. We all shed hormones. Some of the very low level radioactive elements that may be naturally occurring are occurring very low levels. And so that's kind of the scale we're looking at. So the salts are the percent range, the part per million range, high part per million range, whereas some of those other chemicals may be found at the part per million to part per trillion range. As we go down, then we get into these new emerging contaminants that are now being studied in places like the University of Arizona on how to get rid of as a part per trillion, part per quadrillion range. And the problem with those contaminants is that we really don't know what their impact is on our health. And so what has that got to do with you as a well owner? Obviously, we don't really know how many of those contaminants, those new emerging contaminants are going to wind up in the groundwater eventually. We know that some of the contaminants that wind up in septic, such as salts, for example, and I'll talk more about that later, can and do wind up in the groundwater eventually over time, nitrates and salts. So you always need to be careful of what you put in your septics. And so potential sources of groundwater contamination include obviously your septics, your septic tank. Traits, pathogens can fairly easily move through the Vador zone. This is obviously an exaggerated cartoon, and move freely throughout the groundwater, and you wind up into your well. No matter which direction the water flows, the well can change the flow of your aquifer very easily, and actually uptake contaminants. Other kinds of contaminants that are similar in characteristics come from your animal waste. Similarly, nitrates and pathogens. We have also this category of contaminants. Gary may have mentioned the hydrocarbons, basically fuels that are either storage tanks, diesel, gasoline, that we call those floaters, which means that they tend to float on your aquifer if they ever make it down there. But some of those floaters do dissolve and they move long distances, and they can be a problem. And finally, the worst category are solvents that tend to be, we call those sinkers. They sink through the bottom to the bottom of the aquifer. If you happen to have a shop that has solvents and things like that, be careful with those, because they do tend to move through the profile, and they're very difficult to get rid of in the groundwater. So common contaminants in Arizona are really much more mundane, to the extent that we have a lot more information about those. And those are based on a 20-year-old study by the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, include arsenic, nitrate, fluoride, and gross alpha radiation. We won't talk about metals and lead and cadmium and things like that at this point, because even though we have data on that, it's much less widely available, and therefore we cannot generalize as much as we can with those other 5 types of contaminants due to this long-term study. So this is a map of that 20-year study that I'm going to summarize in a minute, and shows here a map of Arizona. This is total dissolved solids, mostly, again, as I mentioned before, due to the dissolution of minerals. And here in your area, you do have, you may have some wells here that may have higher than 500 parts per million TDSs. You know that if you've tested your water, and you may or may not be using a RO unit. We'll talk more about that later. This is nitrates, also fairly common, can occur naturally from agricultural or irrigation or septic systems. As I mentioned to you before, you don't seem to have a lot of issues with nitrates here in your area. That's good. Most of the values are less than 10 parts per million. Fluoride here is also locally due to local geology and fluoride rich minerals, basically not associated with contaminants typically, or with discharges of any kind. And so here you may have some areas that may have some high fluoride, or that you seem to be pretty well, when it comes to that particular contaminant. And the last one, no, two more. Gross alpha radiation, that's a kind of a hodgepodge of uranium and other radiation emitting contaminants that are usually naturally occurring, and you can analyze for them using gross alpha, which is basically gives you counts, radioactive counts, and or you can measure also radon, which is a separate measurement, and uranium, which also has a standard of about 0.03 or 30 parts per billion. And in your area, again, you may have some hit and misses, not too much of an issue. Arsenic is a bad boy here in Arizona, and if you don't do anything, if you don't get anything out of these workshops, please do, if you haven't done it yet, please test your water for arsenic. Arsenic is naturally occurring for the most part due to our rich geology, rich minerals. And the good minerals come with the bad minerals. That is, if you have arsenic and you have lead, and you may have also copper, which is mined throughout. So we have a very rich geology, but that unfortunately also brings some bad actors such as arsenic. And arsenic is not a big problem here, but as you can see, some hot spots throughout Arizona that put many people at risk here for our elevated levels of arsenic. And so a summary of this maps that I want to give you is based on this study that's referenced up here by Towns and Jones from 211 to 216. Basically, was done collecting samples from about up to 1,766 wells throughout Arizona. It shows that about one in five wells has elevated levels of arsenic, 1 in 10 wells has elevated levels of nitrate, 1 in 10 in fluoride, 2. Gross alpha radiation is about 1 in 6 or so. So your odds are pretty high, if you believe the statistics, right, that you could have a well with, let's say, elevated levels of arsenic, 1 in 5. Other findings of this study, which was quite extensive, again, took almost 20 years to be completed, is about more than many wells, about more than 50% of them failed what's called the national, that had elevated levels of TDS, and we'll talk about the standards in a minute. And so, worthy to note is that about 50% of those wells that were sampled of that study were private wells. So that only gives you data about production wells, such as those used by public water utilities, but also data that comes from your own private wells. So it's significant findings here. Background about the standards. So we mentioned to you before that drinking water standards do not apply to you, and we'll be saying that again. So you're really responsible for the water quality of your well, and make sure that you're not drinking bad water. But quickly, a quick background, 1914, we had some biological standards, but it wasn't really until the 70s that we moved through the Clean Water Act, and later on the 1974 Safe Clean Water Act, that gave the federal government the authority to set what's called maximum contaminant limits, which are basically protective of our health. And the important thing is that they're constantly evolving, but again, they don't apply to you. Those standards are, let's go very briefly through them. The secondary standards, which are non-enforceable, and again, those tend to be more related to aesthetics and taste and delivery. So water, for example, you may have bad, metallic taste in your water, high salts. Those are not considered necessarily bad for your health, but they are obviously make the water undesirable or not very good to drink. The primary standards are the ones you need to watch out for. And those are the ones that are associated with some health consequences. So, and those have MCL standards that again are enforced typically by two public water utilities, and there are penalties associated with that if they're violated. The public water utilities cannot exceed MCLs, and if they do, they have to report that to the public. But private well owners are exempt. You are exempt. So again, if you don't learn anything from this workshop, is that you really should be testing your water, making sure that it's safe for you, at least from the contaminants, some of the contaminants that we mentioned, and some of the ones we will mention again. This is a secondary water standards, and they are basically for TDS 500. So a lot of people drink water with higher than that TDS salinity and nothing happens. But if you get much higher than that, then taste and other possible consequences, long-term consequences could occur. But again, it's not associated with a health issue at this point necessarily. Fluoride has two standards, a 4 and a 2. The 2 is a secondary standard, but the 4 is the primary standard now. And then you have copper, also has two standards. There's a copper rule now related to copper and lead. And again, violations at this level are health-related. Violations at this level are mostly cosmetic or taste-related. But the important ones, again, are here. The primary water quality standards are divided. There's over 90 individual and classes of contaminants that are fall under this category. And they're divided into 6 categories: inorganic chemicals such as, inorganic like arsenic and lead, inorganic chemicals as atrazine, benzene, and many others, solvents, herbicides, and so on, hydrocarbons, radionuclides, as I mentioned to you before, gross alpha radiation, uranium, and then there are also disinfection byproducts, also regulated. So we mentioned before organic matter, right? So one of the things that happens when you mix chlorine or another powerful oxidizing agent with organic matter is that you form this disinfection byproducts. We did not know that when we began to disinfect the water early in the first part of the other century, and we saw huge drops of mortality rates of waterborne pathogens, associated mortality rates. But we didn't realize until the 60s and 70s, when analytical chemistry caught up, that these chemicals were formed as a reaction between chlorine chemicals and organic matter ever present in all waters, even again deep groundwater. And they form those chemicals, several families of them, and there's always new ones being found. Many of them are carcinogenic or have carcinogenic properties. So that's why Gary and I recommend to you that if you want to chlorinate your well, that this be done using a contractor that basically is able to properly scrub the well and then pump the well out and make sure that there are no residual levels of any of those chemicals, or at least chlorine, that could be bad for you. Turbidity is important, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about filtering your water, and because it's now associated with chemicals and pathogens. Oops, excuse me. Finally, microorganisms, we'll talk about that, about particularly indicator tests to make sure that your water is safe. So those are the 6 categories that are regulated now in public water supply providers, but again, they don't apply to you, but you should be aware of them. This is just one page of this primary drinking water standards. We're just mentioning here arsenic, 10 parts per million, 10 parts per billion, I'm sorry, as of 2006 standard, and it has a lot of potential problems associated with it, and that's just a small sample of it. And again, it's unfortunately associated with natural deposits and so on. So when do you test your water? So here we're beginning to test your water. It's important that you consider the location, right? When to sample, and then use a Arizona certified lab. And this is a telephone number of the Arizona Department of Health Services. And this is the agency in Arizona that regulates or certifies laboratories for drinking water testing. There's a list on their website of facilities of the laboratories in Arizona that are certified by calling this number and or going to their website. I'll mention their website in a minute. The costs vary. So where do you sample? So typically we would like to sample at the wellhead. If we're looking at making sure that we are looking at just the groundwater contamination. But again, if you sample inside your kitchen sink, you'll have to go through the storage tanks and pipe, and they can be also adding some contaminants to it. So you should be mindful of what kinds of pipes you have in your house and whether or not they could potentially have some contamination. So it's important to realize that. So when to test? So there is a table 8.1 in the Well Owner's Guide, 2nd edition, which we recommend that you download if you haven't already, and look at that table. And so we have an annual recommendation. We also recommend, and I'll mention some of those in a minute. We also recommend that you test your water if you have any change in taste, visual, color, or so on, any changes in health, and after any pump maintenance or activity or flooding near the wellhead. So the costs vary, but the basic water quality parameters that you may want to consider to test, at least initially, not necessarily every year thereafter, are pH and salinity. They should not change over time a lot. Neither will those other ions, but they'll give you an idea of the quality of your water that you're drinking, sulfates, chlorides, so on. Fluoride, nitrate, and arsenic, you should test initially and know that information. Nitrates, you might want to consider testing annually because they are very mobile in the environment and they could come from your septic. Arsenic, you might want to test every 2 to 3 years, but it won't change very often. And neither will fluoride, because if it's in your aquifer, it will be there forever. And then gross alpha radiation, the same thing in uranium. Once you've tested for it, very likely will not change over time. And then pathogen indicators tests are important that you do them manually at least for total and fecal coliforms and E. coli. And those tests alone may be $50, but in total, all those tests may initially cost you about $200 to $300, and thereafter, you may want to look at a test that may cost you maybe $70, maybe $50 to $75 if you do indicator tests, total and fecal coliforms, and nitrates, at the very least annually as a safety precaution. Water testing costs here, if you were to do all of those tests that are in the National Primary Drinking Water Standards, you would see tremendous cost increases. Excuse me, my finger is a little touchy here. But would you have to test for all those standards that are listed to you before, the 90 categories of families of contaminants that are listed? No, you don't have to do that. Those are usually done by only for production wells, and they would cost a lot of money. We don't recommend you do that. So that's, just stick to the list that we provide you there. And then if there are any, and make sure that your well is registered and the registration and address is up to date, so that you, if there are any issues happening in your local area, that you would be properly notified by the Arizona Department of Health Services or ADWR or other agencies that may want to warn you about a potential issue in your area. So make sure that your well is properly registered and it's under your name, as Gary suggested. Water testing laboratory should provide you with clear, sterile containers, clear instructions on how to collect your water samples. And water testing laboratories, again, must comply with state and federal guidelines and use EPA approved methods and so on, and be certified again by the state of Arizona. Water testing tips. So proper sample collection includes basically flushing the system, well purging when appropriate. But most of the time, you have to avoid collecting water, stagnant water, Okay, so the best time to test is basically at the end of the day after you've done your laundry and you've done your irrigation and you've flushed all your pipes and your storage tanks and you're really collecting then at that point fresh aquifer water will be representative of what's in the aquifer, not what might be added from a long stagnant water inside your tank. Auto treatment options. So here we are now with this started as a basically you should consider treatments, and when you do consider options and treatments, make sure that you connect with treatment professionals that are reputable and that can help you determine the best treatment approach. But the more informed you are about what your options are, the better off you are. And that's why we're giving you the following sections. And those are also in your well owner's guide, as well as this other publication called Arizona Know Your Water Guide. So symptoms, filter guides, and order of treatments, and then finally specific treatments. So let's look at the treatment options. So consider symptoms. Visual color, cloudiness, so that may be due to aquifer fine particles, organic matter, pipes, tanks, case corrosion. Bad smell or taste, that could be due to salts, metals, solvents, hydrogen sulfide, reduced conditions, algae, chlorine, if you were to add too much chlorine. Illness and particularly people who visit you and due to pathogens, bacteria and viruses and parasites. And then of course the other problematic issue that we have in Arizona is hardness due to excessive salts and scale deposits. Rarely do we have issues with low pH. It's sometimes high pH that can cause also corrosion. So all those things need to be considered before you start looking at treatment options. One more thing before we talk about treatment options and how to approach them is look at this table in here, a filtration guide. This gives you an idea of the sizes of contaminants. So clay, for example, a clay size particle is similar to some bacteria and some viruses, but primarily viruses are even smaller than that. So colloids, we call them colloids, right? And we could use microfiltration or particle filtration to get rid of those things. If you get into silt, then you're looking at removing primarily things that are very large in diameter, like parasites, and sand. So that gives you an idea of the size. So we've forgotten the rest of the chemicals here. So as we go from right to left, the point of this guide is that you're going to see a significant increase in cost and energy and complexity of your water treatment system. So you should be aware of the sizes of those chemicals, of those contaminants, and why, and things cost progressively more as you go from right to left, and you're making decisions. And now we're going to talk about those filtering processes next. So how should we start water treatment? So the sequence should be starting first with removing particles. So if you have cloudy water due to, as Gary said, perhaps something that may be coming, rarely, hopefully, from your aquifer, then you should consider particle filtration or microfiltration. If you don't need that, then don't do it. Just move to the next option, which would be, do you need a chemical treatment? Do you have hard water? Do you have issues with pH? Do you have smell, reduced conditions, sulfides? In this case, you would be using chemical filters like an alkaline, green sand, permanganate, but I won't be talking about those. If you have hard water, I will be talking about water softeners in a minute. If you don't need that, then move on to the next. The next would be, do you want to lower the total amount of dissolved solids in your water? Do you have some issues with nitrates, or you have maybe elevated levels of arsenic, something like that? Then consider reverse osmosis as a very, very able method, which is used quite a lot by quite a few people. We'll talk more about that in a minute. There's also some iron filters that are now able to filter out arsenic as well as fluoride out of water. They're still being developed. Their efficacy changes a lot depending on your water quality. Resins are typically used for large volume filtration. They're very expensive and usually used by laboratories. I had one in my lab for many years. We used those resin cartridges. Tanks were, they were quite expensive to replace monthly. Activated carbon, I'll talk about those because people use those things in their faucets, and I'll show you when and how you should use them in a minute. And the last thing you should consider, if anything, everything else is not needed, is disinfection. Do you want to disinfect your water? And if so, do you want to use chlorination, which is rarely used by homeowners, but I'll mention it. UV radiation and heat, and I'll mention those in a minute. So does that make sense to you all? So first particle, then chemical, then lowering dissolved solids, and finally disinfection in that order. But again, excluding any or all the treatments if you don't need them. Don't add things, don't add water treatment things that you don't need. They tend to actually degrade the water quality rather than help sometimes. So particle removal and filtration, you can use sand filters, or those are for large volume and they're open air, not recommended by home users, homeowners. Typically fiber filters, most common. Ceramic filters are usually only for low volume systems. They're not typically used by homeowners unless they have some kind of a rain harvest system or something like that, a low volume system. But fiber filters come in many sizes, and they do require maintenance. They should be cleaned or replaced regularly. Remember one thing about filters, particularly these kinds of filters, is that they can be a growth medium for organisms and even pathogens. So I had an experience with that in my own lab, but we forgot to replace one of those filters, and it came out a year later, it looked like a pile of slime. So very careful with those filters. Make sure that they're placed also in areas that are as cool as possible, if that's an option to you. They can be backflushed, but they should also be replaced periodically, and they may become themselves, again, sources of contaminants. They do not remove chemicals. They will filter out clay, silt, particles, and even some pathogens, large pathogens such as parasites, and maybe some bacteria, but not viruses. They come in many different sizes, anywhere from 1 micron in diameter all the way up to 5, 10 microns in diameter. You may need to add 1 or 2 in series, depending on whether or not you have a lot of particulates, because if you start with a very fine filter, you will plug it up very quickly due to the large volumes of water that you're going to have to run through them. So the size of those things also matters, and maybe adding 2 in series may be necessary, depending. Chemical softeners. So here we are now at water hardeners, basically removing calcium, magnesium ions that make the scale. And this is usually, unfortunately, uses large amounts of sodium and potassium salts that degrade the wastewater quality. So that wastewater quality will wind up in your septic, potentially degrading your septic performance. And they should not be used in house, garden, or garden plants. The units start at around $1,000, and some, they're all automated now, but they will use more water. So your water use consumption goes up. And they degrade your wastewater quality, again, requiring hundreds of pounds of salts per year. Soft water prevents scale formation, do not lower the total amount of salts, and do not remove salts, they replace the salts. Do you really need one? So be careful when you make that decision to buy one, because there are environmental impacts as well as costs. So resins are used, the calcium, magnesium comes along and it gets trapped into these resins, and then sodium and potassium comes out the other end. And those units are very user-friendly now, fully automated. Well, this is the tank where you add your brine. You happen to have one of those things. But remember, all this salt will wind up in your septic sooner or later. So be careful with that option. Salt contaminant reduction is typically done using reverse osmosis, point of use devices. Water pressure forces salt through a semi-porous membrane, leaving the salts on the other side. So things like sodium, calcium, sulfate, nitrate, arsenic, lead, some bacteria will be removed and or lowered. Exceptions may include radon gas and some solvents, and depending on even some pesticides may not be removed. But most of the stuff that you're interested in will probably be removed very, very well. Again, be careful on the systems. RO units are low pressure, so they're moderate cost, but they increase your water use significantly. For every 1 to 3 gallons of water that you produce, you will use 10 gallons of water to flush the membrane. The membrane gets plugged up very easily because of the low pressure used in your system. Remember, your house has a 40 to 60 pressure water system, 60 psi pressure water system. And so the membrane files up very quickly, and then you have to constantly flush it, producing very small amounts of water in return, unlike the industrial units, which are actually quite the opposite. Removal efficiency is also there, so make sure that your efficiency removal of a particular chemical is up to date, and you do a pre-test and a post-test on the system to make sure that it does remove, for example, arsenic, if that's your concern. Works best with soft water, and so unfortunately then it may require a water softener. That's a double whammy, and it usually increases your cost significantly. Again, soft water does not plug up the membranes as quickly, but it adds an extra cost to your water treatment system. Membranes may leak and break, so they must be replaced regularly. The good news is that those systems are pretty much automatic now. Again, there's a membrane in here that selects or removes some of those chemicals selectively, and allows some of them through, but most of them stay behind in this area here. That basically forms a layer that has to be flushed regularly, and that's your water use increase. The pressure here of your bladder tank or your pump is used to push the salts against this membrane. Pure water comes out the other end. It's stored into this storage tank. It may have a pre-filter and a post-filter, which is good. And the water then, this water, this drain water, this what's called backwash water, has to be sent to the septic, or it could be sent actually outside into your yard, into one of the native plants you may have in there. I don't recommend you put it in your garden yard though. But some tree there that you may need extra water could be a good way for you to prevent this water from entering your septic field. Okay, and they usually are under the sink, which makes many, many plumbers highly unhappy when they have to work on those things. They're very useful. Okay, so activated carbon now. It's very useful to reduce the levels of chlorine, smell, and organic chemicals and pesticides, and even some radon sometimes, depending on they can actually remove quite a bit of radon, depending on the carbon. Usually point of use, the efficiency depends on the amount of contaminant and type of water quality, saline and hardness, and so on. Best used with clear, disinfected water. So I have one in my sink, all right? Those things have to be disposed and replaced regularly. This is my sink. This is my refrigerator here. So the sink here, I have it because the city of Tucson chlorinates the water, as they should, as the water runs through miles and miles of pipe before it gets to my faucet. So the residual chlorine is very efficiently removed by this activated carbon. But I don't know whether or not it removes any other things, because I would have to do chemical analysis. They're very expensive. So they're a bit of a peace of mind when it comes to removing other contaminants. They do very efficiently remove chlorine though. This is the one in my refrigerator, which very efficiently removes chlorine smells from my water. And it may sometimes catch some other things that the city of Tucson, may not filter properly. Every once in a while that happens. So the homeowner or well owner should not rely on those systems to remove high levels of contaminants that are present in the water. They have to be sized properly, those filters, to remove, let's say, pesticides or hydrocarbons that you may have in your water in elevated levels. So that's an extra level of complex use of those things that you require a professional for you to properly size those things and make sure that they're actually collecting and removing the chemicals that you want to. Again, I use them as a peace of mind and to remove just chlorine out of the water. They can be under the sink too, and they're properly sized to remove more chemicals more often. They can also be attached to your faucet. Distillation is the water is boiled and converted to steam, and the steam is then condensed into pure water. And it will remove salts, arsenic, nitrates, fluorides, and most radioactive contaminants, with the possible exception of radon, which will come out as a gas. Home distillation systems are slow volumes, produce maybe up to 4 gallons a day, but it's like having a toaster connected all the time on, you know how much energy a toaster uses, so you should expect a significant increase in your electrical use, 30 or 40 cents a gallon, plus the expenses of maintaining the unit and buying it. So they're not cheap, but if you're really, compulsive about your water quality, then they're a good option, but they're not cheap to operate. Should be properly vented again, and some of the new units now come with activated carbon filters, which are great to trap radon and other organic organic contaminants that may be coming out volatilized as you boil the water, such as disinfection by products, by the way. The cost started around $400 and up. And another advantage is that they do disinfect the water. That's a good incentive to have them if you're concerned about that. The units now are pretty much fully automated, and again, they can come with an activated filter, but do remember that it's like having your toaster all the time, all day long running, and that will increase your electrical bill. Disinfection. So we already talked about heat through this previous section. So we're going to now talk about chemical and UV radiation. So we're almost at the end of this presentation. We're moving quickly. Best use after particle filtration. Okay, so again, when we talk about chemical or UV filtration, we want to have water that has already been filtered out and removed as many chemicals as possible, particularly particulates, so that we maintain a high efficiency of those two treatments. Disinfection, chemical and or UV does not mean complete removal of pathogen. What do we mean by that? The pathogens are deactivated. They are basically rendered inactive or unable to reproduce or infect you, but they're not removed from the system. But it doesn't really matter. They're dead, hopefully. Disinfection, that's not commonly used, but can be used for well owners that have large wells with a lot of water requirement. You can hook up basically a contact tank, a bleach tank with a meter system that delivers a small amount of bleach into your water as it comes out of the well, and goes into this called this contact tank that's necessary to make sure that the bleach or the chlorine does its job at inactivating the pathogens. Then it goes into your pressure tank, and then into your pump system, and then it has to go through a large activated carbon filter, because as I mentioned to you before, anytime you chlorinate water, you will be producing disinfection byproducts, which are quite nasty. And they come in many sizes, but they are expensive and complex to maintain and need regular maintenance. They're usually point of entrance systems. Chemical disinfectants will produce, again, toxic chemicals that cause disinfection byproducts. One very more popular system now, disinfection, is now UV radiation, and UV radiation class A in particular is the best one, the best UV rays that do the most damage to bacteria and other pathogens. And they're not designed really to treat wastewater. They're designed to treat clean water that is, without any particulates. They're flow-through design, need particle-free water. That's important. Again, going back to the previous, what we mentioned to you before, they're large units, use around more than 100 watts. So it's not as bad as distilling the water, but it will increase your water electricity bill, because they're usually constantly on all the time. They're plugged in, you walk away. Consider electricity use. They're usually point of entrance in your house. They cost at least $400 and up. They're very low maintenance. That's the good news. They're very simple design, and they need just a periodic lamp replacement. Oops, excuse me. You can see in here, the system is very simple. It is basically a canister with an inside kind of a fluorescent light that emits those powerful UV rays. The water comes in and out this chamber all the time flowing. You plug that into the wall, and then the UV rays basically zap or inactivate any pathogens along their way. Again, particle-free water is required. They're very popular now, even for homes that are hooked up on public water utilities, kind of as a peace of mind. So I think the well owners might want to consider some of those systems again, but again, they're not exactly necessarily cheap, but they're a lot simpler than chlorination or other treatments. Summary. So we're almost at the end here. The water quality of groundwater varies greatly depending on your aquifer and geology of human activities. I think that Gary Hicks made that very clear. It's a bit of a luck of the draw, location, but also human activity. So wellhead protection is very important for you and for your neighbors downflow, downhill. Gary may have mentioned that the water that flows in an aquifer below your house is not yours. It's only yours until it is inside your tank. Otherwise, it's a communal property. So protecting your wellhead as well as is important for you, but also for your neighbors downstream. Common contaminants in Arizona, the ones that we discussed, were basically very common salts, do degrade the water, some nitrates and arsenic, naturally occurring, fluoride and radioactive elements. So being aware of those major contaminants is important in your water quality considerations. Private wells are exempt, however, and they're not required to test their waters, or please do consider testing your water, at least for the contaminants that we mentioned. Again, refer back to table 8.1 for more explicit guidelines on how to test your water, how often, and annually in particular. Private well owners are responsible for maintaining their wells and protecting their groundwater, again, testing their well water regularly. Again, protection of their well is very important. Once contaminated water is difficult and expensive to treat to drinking water standards. I think that I maybe made that clear in my last section, where I talked about the options that you have to treat your water. And so it does get more and more complicated as the contaminant gets smaller and smaller. And so treating water to drinking water standards is not a cheap process. So do it carefully if you have to do it. Home water treatments, from particle filtration to reverse osmosis and disinfection, vary greatly in cost and complexity, again, supporting the previous statement. All water treatment systems require periodic maintenance and testing to ensure continued efficiencies. They're not plug-and-play systems. Oftentimes people complain that those systems require a lot of maintenance, or they forget to maintain them. Remember what I said to you before about filters. They can actually themselves be sources of contamination. So maintaining those filters and replacing membranes is important for you to ensure water quality. And so finally, we're almost there. UV extension publications include the following. We have this that Gary already referred to, whether or not you should chlorinate and why you should chlorinate, being very careful about that, and with some assistance from professionals. Please read this bulletin. We have another bulletin on maintaining and troubleshooting wells. Gary alluded to that. This is a great bulletin, I think, to the extent that it has a table that will give you some very important information about how to maintain your wells. Another one is drinking storage tank disinfection and maintenance, if you have those. More and more Arizonans have to, unfortunately, depend on trucked in water. Another one is record keeping and registration that Gary mentioned. It's an excellent primer on how to do that stuff that Gary covered. We also have some general education about aquifers in Arizona, and the first publication that we had, Arizona Know Your Water, the second revision of it. And now here we have one that we recommend that you get a copy of, which is the Well Owner's Guide to Water Supply, second edition, which was again co-authored by myself and our other partner in crime, Christine Allman, who's retired, and Gary Hicks. And one last couple more things. We have this well-owner video series that we often forget to plug. You'll hear that was produced by Christine Ullman and narrated by Gary Hicks. And they're all online on YouTube. Aquifers in Arizona, well drilling, well components, great videos. And this is the list of publications. I hope that many of them will be available on the websites there of Cochise. And some of them that are new ones. We have a new one coming out that hasn't been published yet on how to build your well sounder. We have one that just came out on shared water wells. And we have on sodium in drinking water and radon drinking water, co-authored with ADHS. And many other ones that we've co-authored over the years that we think will be helpful to you. And 15 other related publications you can find on in the website of University of Arizona. Oops, excuse me. And we also can provide you those publications through a thumb drive. It's available on request. So if you want a thumb drive with all those publications because you're having a hard time downloading them, please pass that request on along to our offices and extension in Cochise, and we'll be glad to send you one. And with that, one last thing, the Arizona Department of Health Services, again, has been our sponsor of this workshop for the last 5 years, and they have an excellent well water quality webpage, which talks about many other things that, or has some of our references published in there and some other more guidelines that they have put together. And they have a very interesting now private well data that you can look up that provides information about common groundwater contaminants in well owners' basins. You can go there. It's an interactive website and look up water quality around your area. Obviously, it's all done without any identification. So, and so you'll be able to kind of get an idea what your water quality is around your area anonymously. So with that, I'm going to end it and open it up for questions. If you have any questions, I'll turn it over to to Marianne if she's been collecting questions, and Gary and I will be hopefully try to answer as many questions as we can. Marianne?
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I know I learned a lot. That was amazing. Thank you. And this will be recorded, so we'll make that available also on our WaterWise website. Just search for WaterWise Cochise County. We've only had one question. If anyone else has other questions, please type them in. We had a question for Gary regarding cone of depression. And the question is, how many feet is this cone of depression in your average private well? Any estimate would be great, they wrote. Is it closer to 5 feet, 50 feet, 500 feet? I don't know if you can say a general answer to that question, but if Gary could let us know. Thank you.
Okay, am I on now? You can hear me? It depends, and it depends on so many different things. If I knew the pumping rate of the well, and if I knew the kind of permeability of the formation that it was drilled in, we can make rough estimates of how big the cone of depression might be after a finite amount of time of pumping, because it starts out very small and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. When we have ways that we measure and determine that, but it takes some other wells, that non-pumping wells in the nearby area that we can measure and see what the drawdown is in them. When doing something like a long-term test to actually determine the size of that cone of depression, it takes sometimes a week of pumping to have an impact be seen out, hundreds of feet away or thousands of feet away. At another time, because the aquifer is not very permeable or transmissive, then all of a sudden you turn that pump on and immediately the cone of depression is felt 100 feet away. So no, it's not something that I can give them a number for. It's a concept to think of and be mindful of what might be going on within half a mile, quarter mile, or at the most of your well, private well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think we learned a lot, and my takeaways immediately were to get your water tested if you have not done so for a while, and register your wells. I want to put a little plug in for my mission right now too, which is larger scale rain harvesting is also becoming more popular for those who are worried about their wells. So be looking for some new information about that from the Waterways program. And it looks like we have another question, which is, I get conflicting information on homeowner drilling their own well. Homeowners drilling their own well. What is contact information and or website I can get for information on permitting a well?
Okay, that sounds like a question for me. Yeah, well, okay, first of all, in the state of Arizona, a homeowner can get a license to drill their own well. They don't have to be a licensed water well contractor. That is in the statutes that they can do it. Now, whether or not it's practical to do it kind of depends on location, and how deep you're going to have to drill to get to the water, how deep into the water you're going to drill, and then how large a pump are you going to put in the well. Turning a steel rod that grinds a hole 6 or 7 inches in diameter to 100 feet or 200 feet, that's challenging. That can't be done with hand tools. It just takes too much work, and getting the cuttings to circulate and come out. So that part isn't too practical, but there are people right next to a stream or a river that have driven sandpoint wells in, although those aren't really legal for drinking water. You can get some irrigation water with them. But it's, despite what the literature is out there for other states where they only drill to 45 feet and get all the water they want, it's a little tougher in Arizona to get through the rocks and boulders and get down there and make a well. Unfortunately, it's something that just calls for bigger equipment than most homeowners have on hand.
Thank you. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, or
I think there's a question from a person asking about iron bacteria.
Oh, here we go. Yes, please ask to discuss iron bacteria in water and how significant it is, whether it can be harmful, and if so, how to control it. So about iron bacteria.
So as far as I know, and Gary said the same thing before, I think it's not really necessarily harmful to your health. Problem is all the damage that it's going to do to your steel pipes, okay? And the fact that if you have it repeatedly, you probably also have like hydrogen sulfide floating around, which is going to give you a bad smell in your water, okay? That's a good chance. And that means that tends to happen more in wells that are pretty shallow and have a lot of organic matter. So one way to get rid of it is to chlorinate the water, but you don't want to do that all the time because you're going to be producing all those chemicals. There's also iron filters that will filter out, green filters that I mentioned to you before, that can filter out. They do a pre-chlorination, and then the manganese filters basically trap the precipitates and remove the hydrogen sulfide. Actually the hydrogen sulfide is removed through the chlorination process first, but then the iron and the manganese will drop out of solution, and then you'll have water that it's a lot better than before. But those filters need to be sized properly, for the volume of water that you have. They're not cheap, they're expensive, and they require regular maintenance. Does that help the person?
I hope so. We have another comment question. I have a deep artesian well. I don't think chlorination will work.
But in what way, can I ask? Is he asking that, or she?
She says from iron bacteria,
Oh,
four iron bacteria.
yeah, you may need to go to, if it's very high in total dissolved solids and has a lot of hydrogen sulfide, because it is maybe a little, is it hot too? Does it have a little thermal properties? Is it, that's maybe a little heated and they have very, it may be very high in sulfates? You're going to have, I mean, you may not want to be drinking from that water to begin with anyway, because it may be too high in salts and other things.
She says it's not hot,
No,
but
not hot,
yeah.
but is it high in salts? Yes.
I filter it. I don't, yeah.
If you may want to consider a green filter, sand filter, that's the only thing I could think of if it's not hot and if it doesn't have a lot of salts and a lot of sulfates, but it may still smell. I don't know. It depends. What do you think, Gary?
Excuse me, I understood that she said it was a artesian, which to me would mean it may not be flowing. You know, we distinguish between a flowing artesian and one that just has a higher head, because I have had to put pumps in artesian wells where the static water level was higher than normal, but it wasn't flowing. You had to pump them. In that case, then yeah, maybe you could shock chlorinate the water, but it probably would be better to get the water to the surface into a storage tank and deal with it there rather than in the well.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. You don't want to chlorinate the well itself. Okay, that's, we didn't mean to say that. If we implied that, definitely not.
Any other questions before we sign off? Yes, so she says she has an artesian well with submersible pump.
Okay.
If other questions come up, Heather, please feel free to contact either myself or our presenters, or you can contact